Hello and welcome to the BloodStream podcast, a show serving the greater bleeding disorders community, brought to you by Believe Limited and BloodStream Media, and made possible due to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. I'm your patient advocate and host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your healthcare advocate, nonprofit nerd, and other host, Amy Board, reminding you to please speak with a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
The reminding you had a nice little lilt to it. Reminding you. You went into TV voice for a moment there. I liked it a lot. It was very soothing, and I felt reminded.
It is a specific voice, TV voice.
It is, and you've got it, Amy
Great.
Board. You really do.
Good
You're a
to know.
nonprofit nerd, TV voice lady. Got a lot of things going for you.
Great.
We have a packed show, so I better run it down. You got to do an interview I'm very jealous of with Gunnar Esiason.
Yes.
He is a person living with cystic fibrosis. He's an extraordinary advocate on behalf of that community. May is Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Month. And of course, he is the son of NFL Hall of Famer Boomer Esiason. And as a kid who grew up in New York, both watching the Jets and listening to sports talk radio, Boomer's been in my life a long time. So having Gunnar on this podcast is awesome. You know who else is awesome? Rich Gorman. We've had him on a few times between this and the Global Hemophilia Report to talk about the ethics around.
He's an ethicist.
He's an ethicist.
Which is so cool.
How many ethicist friends do you have?
He's my lone ethicist friend.
Same, Rich. We need more friends, Rich. Help us out. We have our Let's Talk segment with Joshua Sterling Bragg. All that, believe it or not, and more on this episode. Welcome to BloodStream.
Hey, listeners, as always, thank you for joining us here on BloodStream. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button.
Please.
Just subscribe. Then it'll just, pop up on your thing.
You don't have to do anything else then.
And you wouldn't even have to think about it, which is great.
Yeah, we don't want you to have to think. We want you to enjoy the show.
We don't want you to have to think.
We really are not trying to help anyone think at all about anything.
And follow us on the social media.
Yeah, you know how to do that.
Obvi.
Also, listeners, I want to remind you that the BloodStream podcast is indeed made possible by our presenting sponsor, Takeda. Takeda believes in a world free of bleeds.
It's a great thing to believe in.
I've been believing in it a long time myself. And Takeda is dedicated more than ever in their efforts to offer a wide range of services and support to help patients on their treatment journey. Wherever on that journey they may be. You can learn more by simply visiting bleedingdisorders.com. How about that, a website?
One more time.
Bleedingdisorders.com.
Great.
And for their founding and ongoing support of the BloodStream podcast, I would just like to say thanks, Takeda.
I also would like to say thanks to Takeda. Great. Yes. PJL.
Amy, I've missed you.
I know. I haven't seen you at all.
If we didn't do this podcast these days, we wouldn't see each other except virtually in a few meetings.
Yes. Actually, you popped into a Zoom meeting, I think, last week, and I was like, it took me back. I was jarred.
Is that?
I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out in your background where you've been. I mean, you've been.
Where have I been?
You've been doing a thing.
I've been doing a thing. What's nice is it's kept me very busy, but I'm not traveling. Well, I'll say that. I'm traveling around Southern California.
Yeah.
I'm learning about all new neighborhoods in Southern California.
Actually, but you're not traveling like on the big airplanes.
Yeah, so it's nice to be in this production that's on such an Acela track, but without the added wrinkle that we so often in our productions have to face, which is like some pretty massive travel considerations, which like bandwidth, money, all of it. So. Yeah, but it does pull me away from here and hanging out with you and like being a part of the fabric. So it's nice to do this podcast that we can talk to each other.
But it is nice. We don't talk about this enough, I think, on the BloodStream podcast. Our parent company, Believe Limited, of course, is a production house. We're a content agency, and we also do full-length documentary film. And we have 3 crews going out now at the exact same time. Yeah. We've never had that before. We've had usually just like one little motley crew that's, like traveling the world. And it's fun. There's 3 full-blown productions happening at the same time. It's really exciting.
We had a day 19B this past weekend for the one I'm on. Because while we were in one location filming stuff, we had another shooter in a different location filming stuff. And I was like, oh, this one production this weekend has 2 different, so it's kind of bananas here these days.
Very exciting stuff that's coming out of Believe Limited, I should say.
Yes, and I'm excited to talk more about that stuff when the time is right. I think we talked about this a bit last time too, but of course now the teaser trailer for our Elite Athletes documentary, Redefining Impossible.
Which is called Redefining Impossible.
Has kind of made its way around. We've gotten good feedback on that.
And what a phenomenal trailer.
It's super good.
Like, the footage is really great. The stories that they've captured is really great. And Kay, our editor, did just a bang-up job.
Yeah, she crushed it. Pumps me up to watch it. I'm like, I got to see this. When can I see this? And the answer is at the BDC, August. In Washington, D.C.
That was a great little...
Sign up now. Didn't even plan to do that, did you know?
Actually, we should think about it. now is time for the BDC registrations. And last year, the Bleeding Disorder Conference used to be called NHF, all the things, but now it's the Bleeding Disorder Conference going to be in Washington, D.C. I plan to go. I know you plan to go.
I plan to go as well.
And last year, registration was kind of down. It'll be very interesting to see if registration has popped back up this year. I hope so. I hope you all come because we're doing cool things. We're also fun at the BDC.
We are. We're going to have the science fair. We're going to have movie screenings.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like unlike any other health conference.
You can come. You can hang out with me and Patrick. We're very accessible at the BDC, and we're very fun.
Very fun. In case you didn't get that note. We've got so much content for this show, so I feel like we got to just kind of keep it moving.
Yeah.
Amy, I already admitted how jealous I am of the Gunnar interview. What would you like to share with our audience before we go ahead and get into it?
I'm just going to share how jealous you are because you were the whole driving force behind this interview, and then because of said film project, you couldn't do it, and it was kind of a back and forth to get him on, so I got to do it. And he is lovely. It's a phenomenal interview. Like, don't fast forward, y'all, because I think, he was born into his family, into his advocacy family. And as we all know, a lot of us in the hemophilia community were born into our advocacy families. I have so many stories about that and the push and pull of that. And it's just kind of interesting to see how he navigated through that. And he's really crushing it. So anyway, here's my interview with Gunnar Esiason.
All right, let's hear it.
Listeners, I am here with Gunnar Esiason. Gunnar lives with cystic fibrosis. He is an advocate and a public speaker, and he is the co-host of Breathe In, a cystic fibrosis podcast. We are thrilled to have him on BloodStream. Welcome, Gunnar, and welcome, fellow podcaster. You know all the things. You're going to know all my tricks.
Yeah, Amy, thanks for having me on. It's been a little while since I've had a podcast. Breathe In came to a conclusion a few years back, but it's always fun to get back behind the mic.
We have so many patient advocates that listen to the show, and they love to go back through, I don't know, chronic disease, rare disease podcast. So I'm sure you'll get hopefully a bump from.
It still lives on the internet forever. So that's the nice thing about that.
Also terrifying.
When I run for senator in 25 years, hopefully what I said on the podcast doesn't come back to
You're going to have to get it. Everything has to get off of there. It's great. Well, I guess, tell me, to be lame, tell me your story. Tell me your CF story. What has it been like? Tell me the things.
Yeah, that's a big question. But thanks for having me on. I'm living with cystic fibrosis. I am 31 years old. Actually, I'll probably be 32 by the time this is published.
Happy birthday.
My birthday's coming up in a couple weeks. But I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis in 1993 when I was 2 years old. My dad was at the peak of his NFL career, playing with the New York Jets at the time. And my parents saw an opportunity to put a face on an otherwise very well unknown disease. Cystic fibrosis is a rare disease. And since then, our family's foundation has raised in excess of $160 million in the fight against cystic fibrosis. And a lot of that funding has gone towards clinical R&D, but also improvements in patient financial assistance. The foundation has very much grown as the cystic fibrosis population has, during this generation, been very fortunate to age. It's actually one of the most remarkable stories in medicine right now is cystic fibrosis. And I'm sure we'll sort of get into that a little bit later. But, my life course with cystic fibrosis was fairly typical for someone born with CF my generation. I kind of had some ups and downs through my childhood and some different health hurdles as I kind of got through high school. But once I finally graduated college, my health was basically in a complete free fall. And that was due in large part to the antibiotic resistance bacteria that lives within our lungs inside cystic fibrosis patients. And really what that kind of means for listeners who may not know is that as you treat bacterial infections with antibiotics over and over and over throughout the course of somebody's life, those antibiotics become weaker and weaker as the bacteria evolves to become more and more impervious to those treatments. And that's kind of the negative feedback loop that I was caught in when I was 22 or 23 years old. And I was kind of confronted with the reality that I was very quickly headed to end-stage illness. And what that means in cystic fibrosis is, very quickly short of breath, lots of mucus production, coughing. It's not a pretty sight. And to sort of put a picture on what that looked like at that time, is that when I was, some mornings when I was in the middle of a pulmonary exacerbation or really a symptom flare, getting from the bedroom to the bathroom some mornings to brush my teeth was almost impossible without falling into some sort of respiratory distress. And hearing me talk about that right now feels like another lifetime ago. And I'm sure, like, looking at me through the Zoom call that we're on, it's probably hard to imagine. And sort of the nice part of this story is that after living like that for a couple of years, I finally got into a clinical trial in 2018 for a drug that came to be known as Trikafta. It basically changed my life in a matter of hours. Within 24 hours, my oxygen saturation climbed. Within 36 hours, my cough started to dissipate, and then a week later, the symptoms of cystic fibrosis very much started to vanish. So it's been a wild ride, especially over the last 5 years. But it's really kind of what's going on across the cystic fibrosis population, with a few exceptions here or there. But it's really one of the more remarkable stories out there.
Incredible. I do have questions about kind of the treatment landscape and how that has changed in your lifetime and what that must be like. But kind of going back to patient advocacy and knowing that your parents started this foundation when you were young. Of course, your father is a public figure, is Boomer Esiason, for those that haven't put two and two together. When was your turning point when you kind of took this on your own, that you wanted to speak about it, that you wanted to be a public face and a public advocate for this? What was that like for you as a young man?
Yeah, I think my parents are very aware that they did not give me a choice when I was diagnosed with CF to, go on the cover of Sports Illustrated as my dad and I did when I was a really little kid.
Yeah.
They are very aware that they made that choice for me, and they had no expectations for me as I grew up to sort of take that on.
Yeah.
As I said, when I came out of college and I was very, very sick, at about 22 or 23, I started to be getting more involved with day-to-day operations inside our family's foundation. And one of my first responsibilities was managing interviews for our scholarship program. So, we offer a number of scholarships for people with cystic fibrosis and their family members now who are going to college. And I was handed the responsibility of interviewing our applicants. And I got to meet so many people with CF through those interviews over those first couple of years of doing it, that I started to put together some patterns and some understanding of what people were dealing with. And I could, in some cases relate to them. And in other cases, I was learning, a whole other side of cystic fibrosis that was out there. And it was pretty informative for me to hear, about all the pain points that people had, whether it was not getting a provider to listen to them or, struggling under the weight of the insurance industry, trying to get medicines covered, not understanding the value of this clinical trial versus another competing clinical trial, both of which were hungry for patients, and how to understand which one to choose or which one is a better choice. So all of these kind of conversations kept popping up over and over and over and over again during these these scholarship interviews of all places, that I kind of felt it was like a little intelligence gathering, but also I was realizing that there was I had a platform to start talking more publicly about drug development, patient-centeredness, patient-centered care, all of these different things. And it also piqued my interest. I started just learning as much about it as I could. I started devouring resources, making contacts, building a network. And it's really all due in large part to those interviews that I was doing.
Interesting. You mentioned that once you found this treatment, got on the clinical trial, life changed instantly, which I have never heard anything like that where it was that fast. Did you forget about it? Why are you still a public advocate? Why is it so important for you to still be public about this?
I think, for a few reasons. One, the story of cystic fibrosis is so remarkably successful that other rare conditions should follow our playbook, right? The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation set, a path to treat and conquer cystic fibrosis. And while we haven't achieved a cure, nor have we been able to find a medicine that, positively impacts everyone, right? The medication that I'm on is appropriate for about 90% of the patient population with CF. There's still about 10% of the patient population that unfortunately can't benefit, and they still kind of deal with the classic CF. And really what I've taken away from that is that we have a model for really altering the course of a condition, and that needs to be applied to other rare diseases especially. and it can. So that was one motivating factor for me. But two, right, the quest isn't over, right? We're still on the path to a cure for cystic fibrosis. Patients should have a more impactful role in our delivery of healthcare. And those are two kind of pillars that I sit upon, and that's really the story of why I guess I'm still out there doing what I'm doing.
That's cool. I sometimes feel that patient advocacy is thankless work at times. It feels like just yelling into the void. And so I wonder, how have you seen your passion and your story pay off, and what has it been like when you haven't felt heard?
Well, I think what I realized, especially after I started taking Trikafta, was that I had a very weird career, right? I spent the first 5 or 6 years of my life out of school dealing with intense illness.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until several months into that clinical trial that my wife and I, she was my girlfriend at the time, but my now wife, were on a road trip together. We could finally do things together, right? We could finally just leave and go travel and stuff. And we were, of all places, we were stuck in traffic on the New Jersey Turnpike, and she turned to me and she said, you have the rest of your life to look forward to. What do you want to do with your life now? And it was a good question. I had never once considered it. But after, a summer of reflecting on, where I had been, what I had gone through, the insights that I had picked up of living with severe cystic fibrosis, I realized that I didn't really have technical skills. Right? I didn't have technical business skills or public health skills or, medical skills or anything. Everything was pretty much self-taught through severe disease, talking with patients and other clinical people in the CF world. And I realized that I needed to go out there and get them. So I applied to business school. I got in and I went through 3 years of grad school, got an MBA and MPH. And I decided that I should marry that very technical, technical sort of part of the working world with the very intricate experiences that I had of living with CF, and sort of could see what would come out of it. So actually out of school, I now work for a startup called Florence Healthcare. We provide technology solutions to accelerate clinical trials and to increase the capacity of research sites to actually enroll more patients and make it go faster. So I guess that's one place where I've applied patient advocacy into sort of the working world or into the business world, where my perspective is that if you put the right patients with the right qualifications in the right businesses at the right time, you can actually make the healthcare system more patient-centric.
That's cool. That's cool. Congratulations. That's cool. I read a quote of yours somewhere. The greatest curse of CF is that you know what's coming. And that hit me, and it made me think of our hemophilia patients. And I wondered if you could put more words to that. Yeah.
So, what I meant by that is that our cystic fibrosis community is actually very small, very intricate, very patients very much know each other. One of the weird parts of cystic fibrosis is that because there isn't an infectious disease component to it, 2 people with CF actually can't be in the same proximity of each other. So for decades, we've been practicing the social distancing buzzword that everyone's used over the last
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that.
So we do it with each other, right? So 2 people with CF can sort of share the same strain of bacterial infection, and that can create a whole sort of problems. But one sort of byproduct of that is that the CF community has sort of rallied around, online communities, from the dawn of social media or even before. And as a result, you grow up with these friendships that with other people with CF. And, you mentioned about the podcast that I did earlier, the Breathe In podcast. My 2 co-hosts were 2 women with cystic fibrosis that I had never actually met in person. The sort of downside to that, however, though, is you see people firsthand go through the end stages of cystic fibrosis. And really kind of in the days before Trikafta, really, there was only one ending that we all sort of foresaw, and it was the very severe respiratory disease. And then finally, your respiratory sort of symptoms overcome every other part of your body. So when I talk about knowing what was coming my way before Trikafta hit, I was very clearly and very much a realist, knowing that I was quickly running out of options, and it just so happened that the Trikafta trial rolled around sort of at the right time for me.
Wow. Unreal. So what's next for you? What's next for the community? What are some of the things you're working on, and what are some of the hopes in the next couple of years?
Well, I think, our Families Foundation, we've recently launched an IVF assistance grant for people with cystic fibrosis who want to go through family building. One of the other little unknown parts of CF is that 98 to 99% of men are infertile. Right? We're born with congenital absence of the vas deferens, meaning that sperm can't exit our body unless it's medically extracted. And unfortunately, here in the U.S., IVF is not universally covered. In some states, it's starting to get better. With some employers, it's starting to get better. But broadly across the states, IVF and family building treatments are not covered by insurance. So we've stepped up to provide financial resources for as many families as we can help grow as possible. The second thing that I'm really looking forward to, at least from the development and evolution of the CF community, is we're standing on the precipice of a number of gene therapies starting to enter the clinic in the next couple of years here, especially for the part of the population that does not benefit from Trikafta. So that's a very small part of our population, but on the nice side of it, there's a lot of gene therapies that are sort of working their way through the preclinical stages and then entering the clinic here. And it's going to create like this weird little dynamic, actually, where you have a lot of clinical trials that are going to be hungry for a very finite number of patients. And one thing that I do want to see happen is I want to see that patients take their leverage as a finite resource and start to reform clinical trials for the better moving forward, right? So I think that's one thing that patient communities don't really quite realize they have, and it's that they have the leverage as a finite resource to change things for the better, right? Make them more patient-centric, make follow-up times easier, make clinical visits easier, make the whole process more accessible and easier for everyone. And that's something that I think patient communities should start to rally around, especially as trials start to get more complex in the near future.
Oh man, hear, hear. I haven't heard anybody say it quite like that and quite impassioned. That must be your public speaking. You must crush every time you go out. You actually alluded to it, and my final question, congratulations, you're a dad.
I am a dad. We welcomed our son to the world at the end of 2021, so he's about 15 months old, which has been super cool.
Oh, that's great. Oh, what a perfect age. Well, congratulations. Are you sleeping? Can you sleep? Or
we are trying to sleep. But no, it's been good. He is a super emotive baby. He's very awake, aware. He is got a huge personality. Especially coming from my family, I guess that's not super shocking. But it's been super fun to watch him grow. It's been super fun to see my parents, his grandparents change. It's been fun to see my wife change. It's been fun to see my in-laws change. It's been fun to see me change. But I recognize that the fact that he's even here is something of a small miracle. So it's I try to reflect on it as much as I can. I catch myself just like looking at him, just being in like disbelief. So super, super cool.
Oh, that's so great. Oh, all the heart swells. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Honestly, this was a joy. Where can listeners follow you? Where can we do all the things?
Yeah, so I have a website, GunnarEsiason.com. Good luck spelling that with all the vowels. You can also...
Google it.
Yeah, you can also catch me on Twitter at G17Esiason.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Cool. Thanks, Amy.
Amy Ward and I are now joined by my blood brother from across the pond and the only person I know who I can call an ethicist, Rich Gorman. Welcome back to BloodStream. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here, and thank you once again for having me, even though I'm all the way from the other side of the Atlantic.
Technology is an amazing thing, isn't it? To just get right into it with you, Rich, listeners may recall Rich, along with colleagues Lawrence and Dakota, joined Amy and I some months back, I don't know now, maybe over a year ago, I don't even remember, a paper that they had worked on as people with hemophilia who also had professional roles in healthcare delivery from different perspectives, all contributing to the idea of informed consent. And how are we defining informed consent as it relates to gene therapy? Where are some of the nuances and idiosyncrasies? And as Amy and I were talking about bringing you back on, Rich, the reason is quite a simple one. When last we spoke to you, gene therapy was an investigational therapy. It was in clinical trials. It is now commercially available in numerous places. And we have heme A, heme B. There are differences. The differences matter. So we've now entered into what we were anticipating last we spoke to you. So the umbrella for today's conversation, Rich, is what's changed. What's changed in your mind? What's changed from things you've heard from people? How have the ethics around gene therapy, informed consent changed, if at all, since last we spoke to you? And the floor is yours to kick us off.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, as a technology, I think it's really fast moving. It has now come into these kind of clinical spaces, and that's a very different space and a relationship between providers and people with hemophilia than in that kind of clinical trial context where a lot of the thinking and practice has developed so far. So suddenly being in that much more clinical space, you've got kind of different kinds of patients now suddenly eligible for these new technologies. So it's very different. Your clinical trials, they're often very particular about who's eligible to take part in those trials because they're trying to control for so many things.
Inclusion, exclusion criteria, is that the language that's usually associated with that?
Yeah. And you want people that are going to be good candidates for that kind of trial because it's about generating data and ensuring that there is scientific knowledge about what's going on with all this. Obviously, when you're taking it into a much more clinical perspective, then you're kind of opening up the doors for anyone, and obviously that's great, but it's a very different set of ethical considerations. And I don't know really if there's been lots of discussion around informed consent. Obviously, Lawrence Dakota and I have been kind of banging this gong of consent for a few years now, but I still think there's a lot more work to be done. You've now got this kind of treatment on the cards for people that might not be as familiar with it. Obviously, if you're kind of going into a clinical trial, you're going to maybe be a bit more familiar with what's going on in the kind of treatment development context. Knowing about these kind of gene therapies that are coming through, whereas now actually, it's just out there as something that is available to a lot more people.
Which it makes me nervous. Like listening to you say that, it makes me nervous if I'm being truthful. Like I know it's exciting and there's a lot of good, but I get nervous. What comes up for you as you like sit with that reality as a patient? Yeah, I mean, yeah. So wearing my hemophilia hat, which I mean, it'd be cool if I did have a hemophilia hat, but we can make merch.
Yes. I mean, I think the priority has got to be education, and that needs to come from the advocacy organisations, the patient organisations, and ensuring that as a community, we are doing our utmost to make sure that other people in the community know about these new treatments that are coming into centres, into clinics, but also to try and empower people to ask questions. And when you've got sort of uncertain technologies, you need to really have mechanisms that can support really kind of open and frank and honest discussion between patients and providers. And obviously that's really hard because these are really complex technologies. I mean, I researched some of this and I couldn't explain how gene therapies work. I mean, you've made God knows how many podcasts about this, and maybe I can turn the tables and ask you to explain to me how gene therapies work, Patrick.
Whoa, Rich! No, you got to get your own podcast first. Hold on. No, you tell us what gene therapy means. No, you make a great point, though. You make a great point. I guess there's to follow up though on this education piece. It's difficult for even people like you and I who are vested in healthcare in a way that's different than, we'll say, your quote average patient or average caregiver. And we would struggle to effectively describe the mechanisms of AAV gene therapy. And to your point, there's just the known unknowns. Like we don't know what real world lived experience and data looks like X number of years out for this product, Y number of years out for this product. So from an ethical perspective, there is only so much education that's even available because the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns exist too. So how do we help people get like what's enough knowledge? When is someone literate enough to be able to make a, quote, fully informed decision in the context of a shared decision-making process? From an ethical perspective, when is there enough education?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for ethicists everywhere.
Fair.
But I think that comes down to it's an individual thing about people feeling that they have had the opportunity to ask, that there has been sort of a sort of level of openness and transparency in discussions. So these ideas of kind of treatment remorse, that people might regret adopting gene therapy, or having a course of gene therapy, that's something that people need to be prepared for, because it's not like, say, a extended half-life product, or some of these other products that are coming to market, where if you're not happy with it, if you're not enjoying it, you can go back to your previous treatment.
Right.
Gene therapy is not as easy like that. So making people aware of some of these kind of just the very different mechanisms of treatment, particularly as a community where we're very used to kind of factor-based therapies.
Sure.
And how those work, and that's great. And I think all the work that's been done in the community to make sure that people are really comfortable and confident, but gene therapy is just a completely different animal.
Rich, what now, since gene therapy has been approved in several places, what have your impressions been of the provider community and the physician community? I'm sure you've heard a lot of people speak about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really varied geographically. I think certain sort of countries and advocacy groups and providers are sort of a lot more advanced in thinking about this and preparing their kind of communities for this kind of oncoming set of therapeutic technologies. And it sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but really I think dialogue and discussion is the sort of hallmark of really getting to the sort of important questions. There's so much that is kind of complicated in these technologies, and just assuming that people will understand it, that people have been following the kind of biotech press releases, been following the kind of regulatory announcements. That's really important. And then I guess the other part that I think for me is really important is language, and the language that we use to talk about these treatments. I mean, here in the UK, a few months ago, the BBC, a sort of major news provider over here, you had the headline of "Cure for hemophilia." Mm-hmm. And that kind of language of cure, I think, is really problematic.
I agree.
In terms of the kind of imaginations and promises that it's creating amongst our communities, but also not just our communities, amongst wider society. And that's one of the huge, I think, ethical considerations about gene therapies is, could the widespread use of gene therapy make society less accepting of people who are different? And then you go into other ethical considerations. If the idea that people with hemophilia have something wrong with them that needs to be corrected, and that kind of language, and then you have questions of what happens to people who perhaps don't want to have gene therapy. What support is left for them? What understanding is left by wider society, when actually the headlines are bouncing around saying, hey, hemophilia's been cured. What's wrong with you? And then even if I did have gene therapy tomorrow, my ankles are still completely knackered. The kind of language that we use, that kind of wider media providers use, and that providers themselves use to talk about these technologies is really important. And I think what's quite, it's going back to your question eventually, Amy, I am getting there with my rambling, is the providers kind of perhaps being aware of the media ecosystem which patients might be coming to them from, and that patients might be consuming this kind of media that is saying, hey, your hemophilia is cured now, great stuff. And that actually, as patients, it's not our job, although some of us it is, to follow these kind of regulatory press releases and get really excited following gene therapy through all these kind of processes and approvals. some people aren't going to be doing that. They're just going to see those sort of base media headlines. And so I think being aware that there are different levels of excitement about gene therapy perhaps is an important lesson for providers.
There's so much in what you just said. And I will respond. Well, I want to add a complication too by the usage of the word cure, which I align with you. I think is problematic. There's also
it shows up way more than I would ever expect.
Same. And
I don't know anything of anything, Rich. And I'm like, really? People still say that word.
Yeah, people, highly credible people who I would prefer not. And yet, if they are themselves sharing the paraphrased words of their patients and trying to describe to others what patients are using, the vocabulary that patients are using to describe their lived experience, it's hard for me to fault someone for wanting to share with that level of specificity. But this particular word carries so much. And to your point, Rich, if you and I today received gene therapy, our ankles would be knackered. And thank you for bringing this, speaking of vocab. And our daughters would be obligate carriers at a minimum. So how cured is this exactly? This is a problematic word. And if hemophilia cured is in headlines, and then you're going to school and you're like, I need an individualized education plan for my child with hemophilia. And they're going, no, you don't. Hemophilia is cured. It's like measles. Just get a shot or something. So there's so many problematic wrinkles to the usage of the word that we're probably best just to move on, because we could spend the rest of our time and maybe we do need a whole episode on the word cure itself. I think I'm ready for it, Amy. I don't know. I think we need to have that episode. And
cool.
I think I know who some of the guests are. But I want to switch gears a little bit, Rich, if we could, to another element of gene therapy in particular, where for me, ethics come into play, and that is the registries. So on one hand, we talked earlier about a lack of real-world data and how individualized these experiences are. And yet, on the other hand, the registries are what, over time, put all of the individual experiences into one collected place so that we can analyze them and, based on that analysis, learn certain trends, community population level trends. Oh, factor 8 levels are really falling off between years 7 and 8, or whatever it is that we will come to learn. So there's a lot of good with the registries. I understand it. It's great that the WFH is in a lead position. And here in the U.S., we have Athens, highly credible place to be the entity to provide the data to Athens on a global level. My question is, where do the ethical flags for you get raised? Because with all this data being collected and stored somewhere, and if you ask anybody, okay, well, who's looking at it and for what purposes? In my experience, the answers are some version of, well, credible scientists, and they can apply to use it. It will be de-identified. Okay, but that's pretty broad still. And so for me, I'm willing to, what's the word? I'm willing to submit to science and to the process and to the fact that I don't know how all of my data is going to be used if I go forward with gene therapy and that data is collected. I don't know, and I've decided I'm okay with it. But that's me. As an ethicist, how do you think about that piece of the pie?
So, I mean, it goes back to an ethicist's favorite word of consent. It needs to be those procedures of informed consent, that people understand what is their data is going to be used for, and that actually participation in the registry is different to perhaps participation and access to medicine. Are those two mutually exclusive? If you don't participate in the registry, then what happens? Are you still eligible for these kind of new cool novel treatments?
Right.
Because that then becomes are people really consenting to be in that registry, or is there a kind of power dynamic involved there? Has their doctor
they
told
want
them
access and have to do it?
Yeah, exactly. So you've got things like that. And what's it going to be used for? Who gets to decide what it's used for? And you see some registries for other conditions, for other sorts of biomedical data, where actually having people from the community as a sort of co-involved panel that get to sort of comment on or feedback on applications to those registries. And I think there's definitely more space in haemophilia for that kind of in the UK we call it patient involvement, where actually it's co-developed with people with haemophilia to say, actually this scientist and this group of scientists have applied to the registry. we think this is a really cool study that will benefit our community versus, hey, this just looks like a scientist that wants to write a paper.
Rich, on a personal level, how have the last few months impacted your thinking about gene therapy in your potential future? If you feel comfortable sharing that, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, dang.
Yeah, no. It's an interesting question. I'm still highly ambivalent, gene therapy agnostic. One could say, like, I know it's out there. But what power it has for me, I'm not entirely sure right now. As we were saying earlier, I could have gene therapy tomorrow, but my ankle's still in a terrible state, and that's not gonna fix that. So actually, the aspects of my hemophilia that gene therapy could contribute to on the bits that sort of bother me. So it's, I guess for me personally, it hasn't been a priority as something to sort of get too excited about. I mean, as an academic that's interested in all of this, it's fascinating. And yeah, I'm really interested in how we as a community begin to sort of make sense of this as gene therapy comes into the clinic.
Rich, as we kind of wind down, patients or caretakers, parents that are listening that might be thinking about this, are questioning, wondering if they should talk to their doctor, wondering if their hematologist is the right hematologist. What are some of your words for them as they are embarking kind of on the decision-making process? And to, what are some red flags maybe in a conversation for them to be aware of?
I mean, I think 100% people should be talking to their clinicians and providers about it, because I think it's really helpful to understand how sort of on the money your provider might be about these kind of recent changes, and kind of where they sit in terms of being sort of up to date with the science and the regulation and what's happening. I mean, I think it's really interesting to ask what they think about the treatments, and to sort of see if it kind of relates to their own research interests. That's always something that I think is really important to do, because we know, and it's really great that this happens, but a lot of hemophilia providers are also research active, and I think that's great because it means we do get research led treatment. But I think it's really important to understand is your clinician someone that is really involved in this kind of gene therapy research? Are they going to have a kind of heightened excitement over it, or perhaps the opposite? Perhaps they're kind of really interested in pursuing other lines of therapy, and as a result, they might think, no, it's not as good. So I think you're trying to find the opportunity to identify other people to talk to as well. Whether that's within the advocacy groups or clinicians, providers, colleagues, and just finding out more about what is happening locally. But I think you beginning to have those conversations is really important. I think knowledge is power in this case, and I think the more we have conversations about this, then the better it will be. I mean, I think the other thing to sort of be aware of and remember is that perhaps providers aren't prepared to have these conversations themselves. And there's an opportunity, responsibility perhaps for the advocacy groups and the sort of networks of providers to sort of begin to think about what training needs providers might need in order to sort of have conversations with patients about gene therapies, but also be prepared for perhaps some of those kind of less clinical questions, more ethical questions. Like, well, how does this change my identity as someone with hemophilia? I mean, it's not something.
Good luck, hematologist.
Exactly. Unless they've come back and done a second degree in kind of philosophy, which would be really cool, and I'd happily advocate for. It might not be the kind of question that they're prepared to or expect to answer, and they might even not assume it's their responsibility to answer those questions. But again, as we were saying earlier, gene therapy is such a different technology. it has kind of much more social and emotional impacts as well as clinical impacts that I think, as part of any equitable conversation, there needs to be space to ask those kind of identity-based philosophical questions as well. And I think it's important that providers can make space or bring in colleagues with expertise to support people to explore those lines of thinking too.
Greg Blamey is a clinician at a hemophilia treatment center in Canada. We had him on BloodStream some months back to talk about sexual health in particular. And he made the point of how often sexual health just doesn't come up at all in the context of a clinic visit. And he said this in stark terms: we call this comprehensive care.
Yes.
We, the providers, we dubbed it that. So if we want to fulfill what we've called it, we have to deliver on that. And I think that means sexual health. That means, hey, gene therapy's here. We have to have conversations about ethics and identity at a level we didn't before. You're not ready for that center? That's okay. Get ready for it. No one was ready for it. And now it's here. And so now we have to just change. You have to evolve. And I do think there's a responsibility on the advocacy side of things to make sure that in addition to educating our patients, our caregivers, policymakers, that we are not just saying, oh, and here walks in the physician, everybody applaud and let them on stage and let's listen to what they have to say. Sometimes they need help too. And if we only ever ask them to be in leadership positions, we put them in a tough spot as well. If we never say to them, hey, here's some materials we wanted to make available to you. Hey, we have a session during our weekend that has, a scientist from the CDC who's particularly expert because we thought you amongst patients might enjoy some of the education. We have to think a little bit more creatively, as do the centers. And Rich, I want to have you back. So let's make a plan, Amy Board, right now. Okay? And if this is a terrible idea, Keith Japney team, we can cut this part at the end of the podcast. But Amy Board. That's you, right?
That is me.
We have a new podcast.
Oh my God, a new podcast. Tell me more.
It's really cool. And it is called PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow.
That is a great title.
I know. This is a brand new podcast from BloodStream Media, sponsored by Pharma Essentia, and it's about polycythemia vera, otherwise known as PV cancer.
What is polycythemia vera?
Yep. Alternate pronunciations.
Great.
That's a great question.
I do ask good questions.
And I'll tell you.
And I know how to pronounce stuff.
Polycythemia vera, or PV. You can say PV. Great. PV for short. It causes your bone marrow to make too many red blood cells. So these excess cells thicken your blood, slowing its flow, which may cause serious problems like blood clots. And we've created this podcast to help support the PV community.
I love that. Let's listen to the trailer for the new show.
Okay, you or a loved one has just been diagnosed with polycythemia vera, otherwise known as PV. It's a rare blood cancer that causes your bone marrow to create too many blood cells, especially red blood cells, which creates a higher risk for blood clots and stroke. I know, it sounds pretty scary. Maybe you were told that...
It's okay. You'll die with PV, not from it.
Comforting? Possibly. Or maybe you read on the internet that...
If you're gonna get a cancer, get PV.
Wait a minute. Do we really trust what the internet has to say? We'll tackle all this and more right here on the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow.
Whether you're a PV patient or caring for one, we want you to know that you're not alone. We also understand that PV might be downplayed by people in your life who don't appreciate the total impact of a PV diagnosis on a patient and their family. This is why we've created the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow.
On the first season of the PV Pod, we'll get into what polycythemia vera is, how it's treated, and how you or your loved ones can manage this rare disease. We'll talk to patients, caregivers, physicians, and advocates. We'll talk about what it's like to live with PV and how to be an advocate for your health.
Join us soon for the season premiere of the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow, available wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe now. The PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow is produced by Believe Limited and made possible by Pharma Essentia.
That was incredible. I am very excited about this show. Honestly, I'm very excited about this show. I've read several scripts and I love it. So if your organization is looking to create an original podcast or maybe sponsor an existing podcast within the BloodStream Media Network, you can email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com.
And don't forget to go subscribe to PV Pod Stories from the Marrow as soon as you finish this episode of BloodStream. All right, we'll next move into Let's Talk with Joshua Sterling Bragg, our mental health segment, this time focusing on the connection between physical and mental health and how eliminating certain things from your life can lead to discoveries in other parts of your life. I'm doing a lot of gesturing here to get this part of the podcast out.
You are. It works. Let's Talk is a partnership between BloodStream Media and Sanofi, and it aims to create an environment where we can have open, honest conversations about mental health in the bleeding disorder community. Let's Talk strives to shed light on topics that are often invisible and not spoken of in the community and share tips on how to care for your or a loved one's mental health. If you or someone you know has experienced feelings that have impacted your mental health, talk to your healthcare provider and find educational resources at letstalkmh.com. Sanofi is proud to sponsor this podcast segment because they believe that each of us has a story. Visit shareyourwhy.com to meet the Sanofi core team and hear from them and members of the community about their story and passion for the hemophilia community. Now let's get on to Let's Talk with all of the things.
With all the things.
With the connecting the physical and the mental.
I'm over 100 days sober from alcohol, which is something I never really expected to say. It's not because of addiction, although I did develop some really unhealthy habits over the course of the pandemic. No, it's a choice my wife and I made for our mental and physical health. Don't worry, this segment isn't going to be preachy or self-righteous. As usual, I'm just sharing where I am in my mental health journey with the hopes that somebody listening finds it helpful. Let's talk. Just before New Year's Eve, my wife tells me she's giving up drinking. This wasn't a shocking thing. She'd been sober curious for years now and had been trending away from alcohol for a while until the old pandemic hit. And when it did, we built out a little but mighty home bar so that we could learn to make some fancy cocktails to scratch that itch of going out in public for happy hour. We had plans on New Year's Eve to hang out with some friends, and so we went to a local alcohol-free booze shop and picked up some drinks to experiment with. Heineken 0.0, a bottle of bubbly wine, and a dupe of tequila. I, on the other hand, decided to drink that night because I had bought a $40 bottle of port and had been making a big deal about it to my friends. In my family, we have a winter tradition of stripping down the dining table after dinner and passing the port, eating stinky cheese and pears and nuts until it's all gone. And although port is one of Courtney's favorite things, she stayed strong in her decision and didn't even have a taste. I was really impressed with her determination in that moment, and although I knew I'd be following suit because that's how we are in our relationship, stronger together, I think that was the moment I truly decided I wanted to take alcohol out of the equation for myself as well. At first, it was really hard. I had been in the habit of having a drink while I cooked dinner and then one with dinner or after, so finding that substitute felt really important to me. We have a tiny, narrow kitchen, which most of the year is so hot I have to be in a tank top and shorts just to be in there, and so that special drink was my reward for cooking every single day. Another barrier was that moment I come home from a long trip or a shoot day and I just want to crack open a cold one. It's funny how we find excuses for stuff like this. I call it the I deserve this syndrome, and it applies to more than just booze. It applies to making random purchases, to extra food helpings, watching an extra episode of something or an extra hour of TikToks when you know you got to get to bed because you got to get up early. It applies to going out, to ordering in instead of cooking, to dessert, to flaking on friends, to flaking on yourself, skipping yoga. It's so easy to look at what a hard day you've had and think, I deserve a little something for my efforts today. And look, you do. You really, really do deserve something for your efforts today and yesterday and the day before, because we're all, not to be morbid, but we're all slowly dying one day at a time, and most of us work really challenging jobs, whether it be physically or mentally or emotionally or even just exhaustion out of sheer boredom. And then there's keeping up with your family, your parents, if you're lucky enough to still have them, and there's life planning and taxes and bills. And then right when you think you have your finances in order, the car breaks down, you have a health scare, the bed frame gives out, your dog gets sick. It's endless. Life isn't easy. Even the billionaires are miserable, maybe even more so than us little folk. They're lonely, paranoid, angry, manic, and so greedy. So yes, treat yourself. Give yourself a reward for just being you today and doing the best you can. But think about that reward. Think long and hard. It's so easy to reach for the beer, to order the chimichanga with extra cheese, to spend the extra $100 on random stuff you find at Target when you're supposed to stick to the list. Speaking from experience here. But if you change your mentality about how you treat yourself, you just might find you get what you need. I'm over 100 days now. 1/3 of the year has passed and I haven't had a single drop of alcohol. I've replaced it, sure, with 0% beer, which I really enjoy. There are so many of them now. But, you know, from my last segment that soon after I gave up drinking, my doctor told me that I had really high blood pressure and that I needed to change my lifestyle. And I listened to my doctor because I want to live as long as I possibly can. I've had to change the way I eat, the way I exercise. It's been a lot all at once. But through this process, I started to think about how I treat myself, and not just treat like reward, but how do I treat my body? How do I treat my mind, myself? And I started thinking about rewards in a way that could be a true gift to my future self. I still have a few 0% beers for the week, but I choose to make that a priority for the weekend. This is better for my body and general health. And I still go out to eat, but I choose to do that once or twice a month, and we make it special. It's a real date night, an opportunity to enjoy each other and not just a lazy escape from cooking. I do yoga or ride my exercise bike so that I can eat freely at an event or a party without doing any mental gymnastics to try and convince myself it's okay. It is okay. Not just because I deserve it, but because I put in the work to make sure my body can handle it. And look, a lot of my issues are with food, but that's just me. But this also applies to like finances as well. I'm in a big hole of debt, but by changing the way I reward myself and the way that I think about all the stuff I want, I've been able to pay off my car and 2 of my credit cards just simply by changing my thoughts from I need this, I deserve this, to I want this, but I need to save for it so I don't create more debt. And in my health journey, I'm now down 20 pounds. I'm on day 20 of a 30-day yoga challenge. My gut health is the best it has been in 10 years probably, and I have loads more energy. I get better sleep, and I'm more productive and creative. And the number one thing, and it took a little bit of time to get there through all of this change, is I'm more consistently happy. And that is the best part out of all of this. Everybody's journey looks different, and what I did for myself won't work for everybody. But what I can say is that you can gift your future self something today, something that would make your future self happier and healthier. And I can promise your future you will be really appreciative. Thank you to Patrick and Amy for giving me a space to talk about these things. Talking can be so healing. If you are on a mental health journey and don't know where to begin, check out letstalkmh.com and click resources. And as for us, let's talk next month.
Thank you, Josh, once again for another excellent segment. Thank you, Sanofi, for the continued support. And while we're on the thank you train, thank you, Gunnar. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Shelby. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Jack Need. I also want to thank Takeda, BelievingDisorders.com, for your ongoing support of the BloodStream podcast. And Amy Board, we have another podcast episode because we do this every other Friday and whenever else we want. Yeah. What are listeners going to hear on the next episode of the BloodStream podcast?
I got to do another interview that you were not able to do because you were doing your project. Y'all, Dr. Guy Young is going to be here. The luminous Dr. Guy Young is going to talk about fitusiran, which is great because I did not
Amy, tell us everything you know
what fitusiran was. And also, please tune in to that interview because I give a horrible like rendition of what the clotting cascade is to Dr. Young. At one point I go, oh my God, because I know a little bit. I was like, so wait a minute, Dr. Young. So this is when, and like halfway through I was like, I've made a terrible mistake. I like don't know what I'm talking about. And Precious Guy Young is like, yeah, so, and then he like very lovingly like saved me. But anyway, please listen to it.
You have never sold me better.
I know.
On engaging with content.
Literally, I was like, please don't cut this. It's the best part of the entire thing is me like giving like a clotting cascade rendition.
You know what?
Of like what happens to Dr. Young.
As jealous as I was of you taking the Gunnar interview, I I think from now on, I'm going to pass them all to you. Because if this is the kind of gold that is in play,
No, it's so bad. Oh,
Amy Board at the
God.
wheel, going rogue,
Going rogue.
is what everybody wants.
Going rogue.
It's what the people want, Amy.
I
I'm
was
telling
talking
you.
about like fibrinogen. Like I have any say in
You
like
know
what fibrinogen
all
does.
about fibrinogen, Amy.
Barely.
You know it all, okay? So, obviously, listeners, there's no better podcast you could be listening to for great education and information
science.
about bleeding disorders. So, subscribe, listen to episodes, tell your friends, do all the things. And with that, that is all for this episode. Thank you for listening to the BloodStream podcast. And if you or a loved one in the bleeding disorders community has a story to tell, we want to hear it.
Yes, we do.
Mailbag at bloodstreammedia.com. We are always filling new segments, casting new projects, engaging with community members. You have a story. We want to hear it. Mailbag at bloodstreammedia.com.
You can also connect with us on social media. Me, Patrick, myself, we're all there on
Amy's
the
there
things.
too. Herself, Amy, me. I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your other host, Amy Board.
And until next time, when you're going to hear the interview of all of our lives, take self-care of yourself. Bye, everybody.